Imagine you are holding a telephone, not a smartphone, not even a rotary dial, just a wooden box, two copper wires, and a voice traveling through the air itself, with nothing connecting the two ends except the invisible will of a man who refused to believe the world had already decided what was possible. Now imagine that man is standing in a field outside Chicago in the summer of 1909, and the voice coming through that box belongs to someone standing 2 miles away, and there is not a single wire between them. Not one. And almost nobody remembers his name today. His name was Charles Apgar. And what he built in a converted barn on the edge of a Midwestern town did not simply bend the rules of electrical science. It shattered them, quietly, without ceremony, without the fanfare that followed Edison or the celebrity that crowned Marconi. Charles Apgar worked in the kind of silence that history tends to forget. The kind of silence that on a January morning in 1914 would be filled by the roar of fire. What was lost that morning was not just a building. What burned in that fire was something that cannot be measured in wood or copper wire or the ashes of notebooks filled with handwritten equations. What burned was the only physical proof that a forgotten man had, perhaps, already changed the world before the world had even noticed. This is that story. Charles Apgar was born in 1865 in Westfield, New Jersey, the second son of a hardware merchant who believed, above all things, in the dignity of practical work. The elder Apgar was not a man of grand visions. He sold nails and iron fittings and lengths of chain. He believed in what you could hold in your hand. His son believed in something else entirely. His son believed in what you could not hold at all. From boyhood, Charles was drawn to electricity the way other children were drawn to rivers or fire. He was 12 years old when he first wound copper wire around an iron core and held it near a compass and watched the needle spin as if touched by a ghost. His mother later said he stood there for nearly an hour, moving the coil closer and then farther, watching the needle respond, his lips moving slightly as if he were having a conversation with the invisible force itself. She said she never forgot the look on his face. It was not the look of a boy who had discovered a trick, it was the look of a boy who had found a door. By his 20s, Apgar had read everything he could find on electromagnetic theory. Not just the popular accounts, but the dense technical papers that most working engineers barely tolerated. He subscribed to European scientific journals at considerable expense. He wrote letters to researchers in England and Germany, asking questions that they sometimes found difficult to answer. He was not trained in the formal sense. He had no university degree, no laboratory position, no institutional support. What he had was a barn. The barn stood on a small plot of land Apgar had purchased in 1903 outside the town of Liesel, in the flat agricultural country south of Chicago. He had moved west after his marriage to a school teacher named Helen, a quiet woman who shared his love of music and his tolerance for long evenings spent in concentrated silence. Helen Apgar was not a scientist, but she understood her husband in a way that perhaps no one else did. She understood that the barn was not a hobby. She understood it was a calling. Inside that barn, Apgar built something that had no official name and no category in the technical literature of the time. He called it, in his private notebooks, the aerial telephone. Others who saw it, and there were very few, simply called it the wireless voice machine. What it was, in the terms we would use today, was a functional radio telephone. A device capable of transmitting the human voice through the air across meaningful distances without any physical connection between sender and receiver. The year was 1909. To understand why this matters, you must understand what the world believed in 1909. The world believed that Reginald Fessenden had transmitted voice by radio in 1906, and that was considered remarkable enough to be nearly miraculous. But Fessenden's work, as groundbreaking as it was, required enormous transmitters, complex equipment, and the full resources of professional scientific infrastructure. What Apgar had built in a converted barn, largely from salvage parts and self-wound components, was a system compact enough to be carried in 2 wooden crates and powerful enough to transmit clear voice 2 miles through open air. 2 miles. In 1909. Without wires. The first successful transmission, according to Apgar's own account, took place on a Thursday evening in late August. His brother-in-law, a man named Walter Greer, who taught mathematics at a local school, had agreed to carry the receiving unit to a field southwest of the barn and wait. Apgar had told him to wait until he heard something, no matter how long it took. Greer later said he had been sitting in the grass for nearly 40 minutes, hearing nothing but the chirping of insects and the distant sound of a locomotive, when suddenly through the earpiece of the receiver he heard a voice. It was Charles Apgar's voice. And what Charles Apgar said, transmitted through the warm summer air of an Illinois evening without a single wire to carry the words, was simply this. "Walter, can you hear me? The crickets are quite loud tonight." Greer said he sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then he pressed the speaking element of the device and said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Yes, I can hear you perfectly." He walked the 2 miles back to the barn in the dark. When he arrived, he found Apgar sitting at his workbench, not celebrating, not triumphant, but writing rapidly in one of his small leather notebooks. He looked up when Greer entered and said only, "We need to increase the range." That was the nature of Charles Apgar. The achievement was never the destination. It was always the beginning of the next question. In the months that followed, Apgar refined the system steadily. He improved the clarity of transmission by experimenting with different carrier frequencies, working by intuition and careful observation rather than formal theory. He extended the reliable range to nearly 4 miles by the following spring. He began to think about what such a device could mean in practical terms: emergency communication between hospitals, coordination between ships in harbor, voice contact between the command post and forward observers in military operations, a use that would have seemed abstract in 1910 and would become devastatingly urgent by 1914. He applied for a patent in October of 1910. The application was detailed, carefully drawn, and accompanied by technical specifications that Apgar had written in his precise schoolteacher's hand. The patent office acknowledged receipt. And then, for a very long time, nothing happened. This was not unusual. The patent office in that era was crowded with applications from inventors across the country, many of them genuine, some of them fraudulent, all of them waiting in a slow, bureaucratic queue. Apgar waited. He continued working. Helen continued teaching. The barn continued to be the most important room in their lives, though no one outside their small circle of acquaintances knew it existed. There were visitors occasionally. A professor from the University of Illinois came twice and went away both times looking slightly stunned, as if he had witnessed something he was not quite prepared to explain to his colleagues. A retired telegraph engineer named Morrison drove out from Chicago on a December Sunday and spent 3 hours in the barn, asking careful questions and taking sparse notes. Before he left, Morrison stood in the doorway for a long moment and said, "Mr. Apgar, if this works as consistently as you say, and I believe that it does, then you have done something here that should be known by a great many people." Apgar thanked him and said he hoped the patent would help with that. Morrison nodded slowly. He did not look entirely convinced that a patent would be enough. He was right to be uncertain. The years between 1910 and 1913 were quiet ones in the Apgar barn. Productive, but quiet. Apgar solved a persistent problem with signal attenuation over longer distances. He developed a more efficient method of encoding the voice signal onto the carrier wave, a technique that would later appear. Independently and with full academic credit, in the work of a Bell Laboratories engineer in 1917. Whether the Bell engineer had any knowledge of Apgar's work is a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. The records that might have answered it were destroyed. Helen Apgar gave birth to their only child, a daughter named Marguerite, in the spring of 1911. The barn acquired a small wooden sign above its door that read simply "Workshop" at Helen's insistence, because she thought laboratory sounded presumptuous, and because the neighbors already asked too many questions. Marguerite grew up falling asleep to the sound of her father's voice drifting across the fields at night, speaking into the air, testing the clarity of transmission in different weather conditions, calling out short phrases and numbers, and waiting for the crackling confirmation from whoever held the receiving unit in the fields beyond the fence. She said later, much later, that she had always thought of her father's voice as something that belonged to the air itself, something too large for any single room to contain. She was 3 years old when the barn burned. January 14th, 1914, the temperature at dawn was 11 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground was frozen solid. Apgar had gone to the barn before breakfast, as he often did in winter, to check on a ceramic insulator he had installed the previous week that he worried might crack in extreme cold. Helen was inside the house, heating water for oatmeal. Marguerite was still asleep. What happened next is uncertain in its precise sequence, though the basic facts were established by the fire marshal's investigation. Apgar's wood burning heating stove, a small iron unit he used to keep the temperature in the barn above freezing to protect his equipment, had a fault in its stovepipe that had gone unnoticed. Superheated gases were channeling back toward the wall rather than up and out. The wooden interior wall, dry as tinder after months of winter heating, caught first. It caught fast. Helen Apgar smelled the smoke from the kitchen window. She ran outside and saw the barn already engulfed along the entire eastern wall, the flames moving with a speed that told her immediately there was no possibility of controlling them. She ran toward the barn, shouting her husband's name. Charles Apgar appeared at the barn door. He was carrying two things, one of his leather notebooks and a single copper coil, the central component of the transmitter, the part that had taken him 4 months to win precisely, and that represented the irreplaceable heart of the device. He had gone back inside to get them. He was coughing badly. His right hand was burned across the palm. He stood in the frozen yard watching the barn burn and said nothing for a very long time. The fire consumed everything: the prototype transmitter, the receiving units, the technical drawings, of which there were nearly 300 pages, the correspondence files, including letters from the patent office, from the professor from Illinois, from old Morrison the telegraph man, from a dozen other people whose interest in Apgar's work had been slowly, carefully building into something that might have mattered. The patent application itself had been returned with a request for additional documentation 8 months earlier. The documentation was in the barn. All of it was gone. Apgar did not give up. This is the part of the story that is almost harder to understand than the loss itself. He did not give up. He sat at the kitchen table with his bandaged hand and his salvaged notebook, and he began again. He wrote down everything he could remember, and his memory was remarkable, filling pages with reconstructed specifications, sketch diagrams, notes on what had worked and what had failed, and why. Helen sat across the table from him, not speaking, refilling his coffee cup, watching the man she had married rebuild a destroyed world from the inside of his own mind. But the world had changed while the barn was burning. Not just for Charles Apgar, for everyone. The year 1914 arrived carrying with it a darkness that would consume far more than one barn in Illinois. By August, Europe was at war. Resources, attention, and the interest of the technical and military establishments that might have supported independent inventors were absorbed into an industrial mobilization of unprecedented scale. The small, quiet work of a man in a converted barn in the Midwest was not the kind of thing that could compete with that. He filed a second patent application in 1915, reconstructed as best he could from memory and the surviving notebook. It languished. He wrote letters. They went unanswered. He built a partial replacement for the transmitter using his burned hand, which had healed imperfectly and gave him trouble in cold weather for the rest of his life. The replacement worked, but less reliably than the original. He was working now in the kitchen of their house. The barn site cleared and never rebuilt, and the kitchen was smaller than the barn, and Helen moved quietly around him as he worked. And Marguerite grew old enough to ask questions that her father answered carefully and completely, the way he answered all questions. He never achieved the recognition he had earned. He never stopped believing the work was real. There is a single photograph of Charles Apgar that survives, taken sometime around 1916. He is standing in the kitchen beside a wooden table covered in equipment, and he is looking not at the camera but slightly to the right of it, as if listening for something just beyond the frame. He is 49 years old in this photograph. He looks older. His right hand, the burned one, rests on the edge of the table, and you can see even in the faded image that the fingers do not sit quite right. He is wearing a shirt without a collar, and his hair is slightly too long, and there is something in his expression that is not quite sadness, but is something close to it. Something like the face of a man who has been waiting for a very long time to be heard. Helen Apgar kept that photograph on her bedroom wall for the rest of her life. After Charles died in 1931 of a stroke that came quietly in the night, she moved it to the parlor, where visitors would sometimes ask who the man was. She would say, "That is my husband. He built something remarkable." And then she would pause and decide whether the person asking looked like the kind of person who would understand what came next, and most of the time she decided they did not, and she would simply say, "He was an inventor," and she would offer them tea. Marguerite Apgar grew up to become a librarian, not an inventor, not a scientist, a librarian. But she kept everything. The surviving notebook, the single copper coil her father had carried from the burning barn, the photograph, a small bundle of letters tied with kitchen string, a handwritten document her father had prepared sometime in the late 1920s that described in careful technical language the principles behind his wireless telephone system, principles that by that time had been independently developed, patented, and commercialized by engineers with institutional support and corporate backing and names that appeared in textbooks. Marguerite Apgar never made any public claim on behalf of her father. She was not that kind of woman. She was a librarian. She believed in preservation and patience and the long view of things. She believed that the truth had a way of surfacing eventually, the way water finds its way through stone. Not fast, not dramatically, but inevitably. She kept the materials her father had left. She organized them carefully. She waited. She died in 1987 at the age of 76, and the materials passed to a nephew who stored them in a cardboard box in a garage in Naperville, Illinois, where they remained for nearly 15 years before a local historian named Patricia Dorn, who had been researching early wireless communication in the Midwest, happened to mention to the nephew's wife at a church social that she was looking for any records related to amateur radio experimentation in the pre-war period. The nephew's wife said, "Actually, we might have something you want to see." What Patricia Dorn found in that cardboard box in Naperville represented, in her later assessment, the clearest documentary evidence of functional wireless voice transmission in the American Midwest prior to 1914 that existed outside the major institutional archives. The technical specifications in Apgar's reconstructed notebook were consistent with what she described as a genuine and independently developed solution to the voice radio problem. The surviving copper coil matched descriptions in the notebook. The photograph showed equipment that a consulting electrical engineer identified as consistent with an early radio telephone transmitter. None of this is enough to rewrite the textbooks. The world of attribution in the history of science and technology is a complicated one, and the absence of the original documentation consumed by fire on a January morning in Illinois means that Charles Apgar's place in that history will always be a matter of incomplete evidence and careful argument rather than settled fact. Patricia Dorn published a careful, thoroughly footnoted article in a regional history journal in 2003. It was read by a small number of people. A local newspaper ran a brief story. A historical marker was proposed for the site of the original barn, but never installed due to budget constraints. The cardboard box is now held by a small historical society in Lisle, Illinois. Visitors are welcome by appointment. There is something that does not leave you when you sit with this story for long enough. It is not quite anger, though anger is part of it. It is not quite grief, though grief is there too. It is something more like the feeling you get standing at the edge of an empty field at dusk, knowing that something was here once, something real and rare and quietly extraordinary, and that the ground holds no evidence of it anymore. Only the dark soil and the cold air and the distant sound of the world going on without remembering what it has lost. Charles Apgar stood in that field on a summer evening in 1909 and sent his voice across 2 miles of open air and waited to hear that it had arrived. It had. It did. The voice arrived. It traveled through the invisible medium between one human being and another, untethered, unconnected by any wire or cable, carried on nothing but the mathematics of the air itself. And on the other end of that invisible journey, a man sitting in a dark field pressed a receiver to his ear and heard something that should not have been possible and said, in a whisper, "Yes, I can hear you perfectly. The barn burned. The papers burned. The carefully wound coils and the handwritten equations and the correspondence from professors and engineers and all the long years of patient, invisible, magnificent work burned in 11 degrees of January cold while a man stood in a frozen yard with a scarred hand and watched. But the voice traveled. It crossed the field. It arrived. And somewhere in the long, imperfect memory of what human beings have managed to imagine and build and sometimes lose before the world was ready to receive them, that voice is still traveling, still crossing the open air, still arriving, still asking the only question that ever really mattered to Charles Apgar. Can you hear me?